She moved through Mercy General's cardiac ICU like a ghost with a stethoscope, invisible by design and practice. Margaret Walsh had perfected the art of disappearing into hospital routine. 3 years of night shifts, 3 years of learning which hallways had burnt out fluorescent lights where she could work unobserved, 3 years of understanding that the quieter you stayed, the less complicated your life became. Her white sneakers made no sound on polished linoleum. The antiseptic smell had stopped registering as a smell years ago. It was just the atmosphere she breathed now, mixed with the faint tang of brewing coffee from the break room down the corridor. Room 340 had a patient who changed nothing about her routine but changed everything about her attention. Colonel James Morrison lay in the cardiac bed recovering from a triple bypass, his monitor tracing steady green mountains across the screen. 58 years old, ex-military frame still visible beneath the hospital gown, the kind of man who'd carried weight that had nothing to do with muscle. Margaret checked his vitals with practiced efficiency. Blood pressure 132/84. Oxygen saturation 97%. Heart rate 63 and regular. She made notes in his chart with the kind of precision that left no room for interpretation, the kind of documentation that would matter if something went wrong. Colonel Morrison didn't know she was David's mother. No one here knew. She'd been meticulous about that. She touched the scar tissue on her left forearm while reading his post-op notes, a habit from older wounds, older wars, older versions of herself that existed in medical records filed under a rank and a name nobody at Mercy General had ever heard. The morning Dr. Marcus Hargrove arrived, the air pressure changed. Margaret felt it the way animals feel weather coming, not as thought but as instinct. He swept through the unit's double doors at 6:24 a.m. with a tailored charcoal suit and the kind of confidence that comes from people who've never been told no. His eye scanned the cardiac ICU like he was appraising real estate he planned to demolish. 23 staff members. 3 senior nurses like Margaret who'd been there since the unit opened. 7 residents rotating through. 12 nursing assistants and techs. He saw a snapshot of payroll he wanted to reduce. What he didn't see was Margaret Walsh standing at the medication cart, her hand steady as surgical lasers, her eyes taking in every detail of his face, his posture, the way his gaze lingered on the employee badges clipped to scrubs. She'd spent 22 years recognizing the particular quality of attention that comes before orders are given. She'd spent 22 years learning to move out of the way before the orders landed. Hargrove introduced himself in the conference room that afternoon. Tall, mid-50s, the kind of doctor who wore his stethoscope like a weapon. He spoke about modernization and efficiency metrics and eliminating deadweight senior staff. He said the hospital board had empowered him to make decisive cuts. He said the old guard wasn't aligned with evidence-based protocols. He said those who couldn't adapt would have opportunities elsewhere. Margaret sat in the back row. She didn't take notes. She listened the way someone listens to weather reports. You couldn't stop it, but you could prepare. The first fracture came 3 days later. A patient in room 338, a 74-year-old woman named Patricia Chen, had been scheduled for discharge that morning based on Hargrove's new fast-track protocol. Margaret had reviewed her overnight vitals. The numbers didn't match the discharge criteria. Blood pressure creeping up. Oxygen saturation dropping from 98 to 94% over 8 hours. Breathing pattern shallow and irregular. These were the whispers bodies made before they screamed. Margaret had heard enough bodies scream. She documented it in the chart. All the numbers, all the clinical observations, everything precise and dated and timestamped at 4:33 a.m. Then she filed a formal patient safety report with the medical director. Not with Hargrove. With the one administrator who'd hired her 3 years ago and still acknowledged her in the hallway. The report stated that accelerating discharge protocols without individualized assessment created unnecessary risk for post-operative complications. It referenced specific vital sign changes. It recommended 24 additional hours of observation. It was professional. It was supported by data. It was also a direct challenge to everything Hargrove had promised the board about cutting length of stay by 18%. Patricia Chen stayed another day. Her blood pressure normalized. Her oxygen saturation climbed back to 98%. By hour 36, she was genuinely ready for discharge. The discharge happened. The patient was fine. But the message was sent. Hargrove's response came through the hospital grapevine, which moved faster than email. Margaret heard it in the break room the next afternoon when two younger nurses stood up and left the moment she sat down with her thermos of black coffee. The movement was too synchronized to be coincidence. Someone had told them. Someone had explained that association with Margaret Walsh was a path to difficult performance reviews, reassignment to unpopular shifts, subtle career complications. She drank her coffee in the empty break room. It was still hot. The fluorescent light overhead hummed its usual frequency, the sound like insects trapped in the ceiling. She didn't feel anger or betrayal. She felt something older and more practical, the recognition that she'd already survived worse leadership than this, and that surviving meant knowing when to be invisible again. The humiliation arrived incremental, like tide coming in. Small waves first, then larger ones. Hargrove began appearing at the unit at 6:45 a.m., just before the morning shift change, to observe staff interactions. He took notes. He asked about Margaret's patient assessments in front of the newer residents, questioning whether her traditional approach aligned with modern literature. He used the word outdated in ways that seemed almost accidental. He started mentioning in staff meetings that some nurses carried biases toward extended observation that drove up costs without evidence. Nobody named Margaret. It didn't matter. Everyone knew. By the second week, she noticed which doors opened when she approached. The resident she'd been training suddenly had scheduling conflicts when she was assigned to mentor them. When she spoke in rounds, she got the kind of silence that meant people were waiting for someone important to actually speak. She'd worked too long not to recognize the architecture of institutional exclusion. She'd built parts of it herself, back when she was the one doing the excluding, back when she had rank and authority and a unit that needed to move fast. Then Colonel James Morrison woke up in room 340 asking for a nurse who actually remembered his first name was James, not Mr. Morrison, and Margaret understood that some people didn't get the memo about which staff members had become professionally toxic. He'd asked specifically for her to help him with physical therapy. He'd told his wife that the tall grey-haired nurse reminded him of someone, a medic he'd served with, someone who knew how to assess injuries without asking questions, someone who moved like she'd seen worst-case scenarios and understood what mattered. He didn't know she'd served with him. Not directly with him, but in his same theater, in Kandahar, in a unit whose existence was still classified. He didn't know the woman in the practical bun had been a senior chief petty officer assigned to Joint Special Operations Command, had run 17 combat medical operations, had called in helicopter evacuations from coordinates that still didn't appear on public maps. He didn't know she'd left that life 8 years ago, had changed her name on hospital paperwork, had put the faded Special Forces unit patch in her locker, the one with the worn edges and the scorch marks from a fire that had nearly killed her, and she'd never looked at it unless she was completely alone. What happened next didn't just change her shift schedule. It changed everything. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she saw it coming, and she walked directly into it anyway because someone needed her to be something other than invisible, and Margaret Walsh had never learned how to refuse that. The first strike came during family visiting hours in room 340. Dr. Hargrove called Margaret in with that particular tone reserved for subordinates he'd already decided to dismantle. Colonel James Morrison sat upright in the cardiac bed, his wife Rebecca beside him, her hand resting on his arm. Hargrove stood at the foot of the mattress like a prosecutor delivering closing arguments. "Nurse Walsh, let's discuss your failure to adapt to modern evidence-based protocols," he announced loud enough for the hallway monitors to catch his voice like a public broadcast. "Your discharge recommendations directly contradict the efficiency metrics this hospital desperately needs. Perhaps you're simply too seasoned to keep pace with contemporary medicine." Margaret stood in the doorway, hands folded in front of her. One measured breath. The kind of breath that came from somewhere deeper than lungs, from a place that had learned composure under fire. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. Or perhaps, Hargrove continued, addressing the room more than her, "You believe your years entitle you to override physician judgment. Rebecca Morrison's face flushed red. She looked at her lap, the embarrassment radiating off her in waves. Margaret saw it register, the patient's family now doubting the competence of their nurse. This was what Hargrove did. He didn't just attack. He made the audience complicit. "Your approach to patient care is outdated," he said, turning to face Margaret directly now. "Frankly, it's a liability." Margaret's jaw clenched once. That was all. One small muscular clench, then smooth again. She wiped a single tear that had escaped with the back of her hand, never breaking eye contact with him. When she spoke, her voice had dropped an octave lower than her usual deferential tone. It carried the weight of something he didn't recognize and couldn't name. "I've survived worse leadership than yours, Doctor." The room went dead silent. Not the silence of agreement. The silence of recognition. Colonel Morrison's breathing changed, he straightened slightly, studying her with new attention. Hargrove's jaw tightened. He'd expected her to defend herself, to apologize, to crumble. Instead she delivered something that sounded almost like pity. He left without another word, his confidence momentarily rattled. But the strike had landed. By Friday, the public board near the medication station displayed Margaret's formal write-up in red marker, "Walsh, resistant to change, performance improvement plan." It stayed there for 3 days. Everyone who passed saw it. Everyone who passed saw her name attached to failure. The second humiliation arrived in the break room that Friday afternoon. Margaret sat with her lunch, a sandwich she'd made at home, because the hospital cafeteria had become hostile territory. 3 younger nurses, Sarah and Tom and Jennifer, sat at a corner table 30 feet away. They'd been friendly enough in her first 2 years. Now Sarah looked up, made eye contact with Margaret, and stood. Tom stood. Jennifer stood. Their chairs scraped loud against the linoleum, the sound like teeth grinding. Jennifer whispered to Tom but made no attempt at real discretion, career suicide. They left. 3 empty chairs. Margaret sat alone under fluorescent lights that buzzed like insects trapped in a wall. The sandwich tasted like ash. That evening, Hargrove executed the final piece. He called her into his office, a corner room on the 3rd floor with windows overlooking the San Diego harbor, the kind of office that announced institutional power the way monuments announce conquest. His voice was gentle now, almost apologetic. "Margaret, I think a change of pace would benefit you. The night shift. Pediatric wing. You'll have time to reflect on your professional approach without the pressure of our busier units." She understood immediately. The pediatric wing was scheduled for closure in 8 months. The night shift there was a skeleton crew, sometimes just her. It was exile dressed in the language of opportunity. It was a cage disguised as a gift. "When do I start?" she asked. "Tomorrow night. 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. I think you'll find the environment more suited to your experience level." The word experience fell like a hammer. In hospitals, experience meant old. Obsolete. Expensive to maintain. When she returned to her station, her belongings were already boxed. A single cardboard container, sealed with packing tape. Security guard Ramon Torres stood beside it, his dark eyes apologetic but silent. He'd worked with Margaret for 2 years. He knew what this was. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "It's not your job," Margaret replied. "Who ordered it?" "Dr. Hargrove. 20 minutes ago." She lifted the box. It wasn't heavy. 3 years at Mercy General reduced to something that weighed less than a case of saline. Ramon carried it to her car, both of them moving through the hallway like they were transporting contraband. No one made eye contact. This was what professional exile looked like. Behind locked doors on the administrative floor, Hargrove was already executing the deeper strategy. He called Crawford and Chen, the board members who'd hired him. "Liability concerns," he said. "Outdated staff making dangerous recommendations. We need to document the pattern before she costs us another lawsuit." He contacted her sparse employment references from 3 years prior, the director of nursing at Naval Medical San Diego who'd given her a vague but positive recommendation, the emergency room supervisor from the year before that. He asked pointed questions disguised as due diligence. Would you say her decision-making has evolved with medical advancement? Have you noticed any emotional instability? Do you know of any gaps in her professional history? He was building a case. Carefully. Methodically. He was competent at this, which made him far more dangerous than simple cruelty would have. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Margaret had seen it coming and she'd walked directly into it anyway because someone needed her to be something other than invisible. Tuesday night arrived with rain hammering the parking lot like applause. Margaret clocked in at 6:58 p.m. and took the service elevator to the 4th floor, where the pediatric wing stretched out in fluorescent-lit emptiness. 23 rooms. One occupied, a 6-year-old with cystic fibrosis. The rest waited in darkness, their beds stripped to bare mattresses. She restocked supply carts in the silence, her footsteps echoing off tile that hadn't heard this many human sounds in months. At 11:11 p.m., the overhead alert crackled through the PA system. Security to ER entrance. Security to ER entrance. Code Silver. Code Silver. Active threat. Margaret's hands paused. She wasn't assigned to ER anymore. She wasn't part of the response matrix. She stood in the dimly lit hallway of the pediatric wing and listened to the chaos filtering up through the building's concrete skeleton. Then she heard it, a voice roaring from somewhere below, words in Pashto interspersed with English, the specific cadence she'd heard in Kandahar field hospitals a lifetime ago. They are still there. Get down. Mortars incoming. The voice cracked with desperation and the particular flavor of rage that came from a nervous system that had learned to expect death. Margaret's training assessment kicked in before thought could catch up. Severe traumatic brain injury. Acute PTSD flashback. Patient experiencing battlefield dissociation. She moved toward the stairwell instinctively. Sarah appeared in the doorway, pale and wide-eyed, nearly colliding with her. Margaret, don't. He's huge and he's got a weapon. Margaret descended against the flow of fleeing staff, her movement steady while everyone else moved like prey animals detecting a predator. In the ER lobby, she saw him, 6'5", clothes filthy and torn, head wound bleeding freely, wild-eyed and swinging a metal crowbar in arcs that could shatter bone. Security guards Franco and Martinez had backed to the far wall, hands frozen on their radios. Dr. Hargrove's office door was locked, his silhouette visible through frosted glass, not emerging. The man's chest movement was asymmetric. His breathing rapid and shallow. He favored his left ribs, the way a body does when one side no longer works properly. Absent breath sounds. Margaret's clinical eye identified it in seconds, tension pneumothorax. His lungs were collapsing. His oxygen saturation was dropping with every labored breath. He had maybe 4 minutes before cardiac arrest. Clear the compound, he screamed, swinging the crowbar through a plastic chair, shattering it into pieces. Nurses huddled behind the triage desk. The man swung again, missing a rolling cart by inches. His balance was off, consistent with right-sided head trauma affecting his vestibular system. Margaret moved directly toward him, hands visible and completely empty, and spoke in Pashto, her voice dropping into a register that hadn't been used in a year. Brother, you're safe. The mortars have stopped. He froze. The crowbar paused mid-arc. The compound is secure, she continued in his language, each word measured and calm. You're with friendlies. His breathing was still wrong. Still that shallow, desperate rhythm. His eyes locked onto hers and something shifted behind the chaos, recognition that another human understood the language his body was screaming. I need you to sit down, she said. The medic is here. He Saturday. Not because she asked. Because something in her voice carried the absolute certainty of someone who had done this before, someone who understood the battlefield and the fear living inside his nervous system. Margaret approached him slowly, hand still visible, and began her assessment. O2 saturation probably around 60%. Maybe lower. She needed a needle. She needed 14-gauge angiocath, the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, direct decompression of the tension pneumothorax before his heart stopped. And she needed to do it in the next 90 seconds. She grabbed the emergency crash cart without asking permission and rolled it toward him. Security began to move forward, but Margaret's voice cut through like a command, "Don't." It wasn't a request. It was a statement of absolute authority. Tuesday night at 11:06 p.m., Margaret restocked supply carts in the pediatric wing's fluorescent hum, arranging tiny endotracheal tubes in descending order when the overhead alert crackled, "Code security, ER entrance, all available personnel." She didn't look up. The night shift in the empty pediatric wing meant nobody needed her for anything, and that was precisely the point. Hargrove had exiled her here to watch her fade into irrelevance, to prove she no longer belonged. She'd accepted it with the composure of someone who'd survived worse leadership than his, though the words had cost her. The supply cart wheels squeaked as she moved to the next shelf, organizing medications by expiration date, a ritual that steadied her hands when nothing else would. The pediatric unit smelled like crayons and antiseptic, a contradictory sweetness that made her chest tighten every time she thought about the children who should have been here, now scattered to other wings because Hargrove believed pediatrics didn't generate sufficient revenue. She was arranging the last row of 4 bags when shouting erupted from somewhere in the building, not the controlled urgency of a medical code, but raw animal screaming, words distorted into something primal. The fluorescent lights buzzed their endless mechanical complaint as she paused, listening. Years of military conditioning made her recognize the cadence before her conscious mind caught up. That was Pashto mixed with English, someone in acute neurological distress, the particular pattern of Kandahar trauma she knew with her body's deepest recognition. Boots pounded past the pediatric wing doors. Someone yelled code on all hospital radios. Margaret set down her supplies with deliberate precision and walked toward the emergency department like a woman moving through water, unhurried, her hands already cataloging what she would need: oxygen, a decompression kit, a clear surface. By the time she reached the ER entrance, the chaos had crystallized into the shape of a 6'5" man in filthy clothes, his head wound bleeding down one side of his face in a steady arterial line, his eyes wild and tracking phantoms that lived only in his shattered neural architecture. He gripped a metal crowbar like a cudgel, and he screamed in Pashto, "They were coming, the shadows were coming, the fire was coming." Nurses scattered like fish shocked by electricity. One nurse dropped her tablet and backed toward the medication room. Another ran entirely through the automatic doors to the parking lot. Security personnel raised their hands and retreated, one of them already on his radio calling for police, his voice urgent and small. The man swung the crowbar at nothing, at everything, the arc of it cutting the air with a sound like wind through canyon passages. Margaret saw Dr. Hargrove's office door, 3 doors down from triage, open halfway, saw him peer out with the expression of someone calculating exit routes, then close. The lock clicked. Margaret heard it across the entire silent department, that small decisive sound of a man choosing his own safety, choosing to let others manage the problem he'd created by cutting security staff by 30%, by eliminating the psychiatric liaison position, by reducing ER buffer capacity to 0. She walked directly toward the man with her hands visible and empty, the way you approached a frightened animal, the way you approached anything that had been broken by the world and was now breaking back. Her voice when she spoke carried no fear, only the absolute authority of someone who'd walked toward worse things on purpose, who'd treated combat wounded screaming in languages that weren't hers, who'd held dying soldiers and told them they were going to make it because the certainty in your voice was sometimes the only thing between a person and the absolute dark. She spoke Pashto, the vowels forming shapes her mouth remembered from 18 years ago. The attack is over, you're safe now, you're in America, you're in a hospital. Her hands remained visible. She kept her movements fluid and slow, nothing sudden, nothing that could read as a threat to a brain drowning in the neurochemical flood of severe traumatic brain injury. The man's eyes, blue, dilated, tracking movement that wasn't there, found hers for the first time, and something in him recognized something in her that went deeper than language. His breathing was labored, the kind of asymmetrical pattern that meant something was actively collapsing inside his chest. Margaret recognized it the way you recognized the voice of someone you'd loved for decades, instantly, completely, with the certainty that comes from knowing a thing at the cellular level. The crowbar lowered incrementally. "The attack is over," she said again in English now, her voice level and low as river stones. "You're in San Diego. You're in a hospital. Listen to my voice." She was 10 feet away. 5. The crowbar wavered like something alive but dying. "Can you tell me your name?" she asked. His lips were cyanotic, the blue-gray color of someone whose oxygen saturation was falling toward zero. "Pierce," he gasped. "Lieutenant Commander. Can't breathe." His left side wasn't moving, his jugular veins distended like cables, his trachea deviated visibly to the right, the constellation of signs that meant tension pneumothorax, a collapsed lung building pressure that would stop his heart within minutes, possibly less. Margaret guided him to seated position against the wall with the same gentle certainty she'd used on soldiers in Kandahar whose wounds were so severe they couldn't process anything but the sound of calm. "I need a 14-gauge needle now," she called to the frozen triage nurse without breaking eye contact with Pierce. "Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line." The nurse didn't move. Margaret ran to the supply cabinet herself, hands moving with the muscle memory of 1,000 trauma scenarios, grabbed the decompression kit, felt the familiar weight of it in her palm. Behind her, Dr. Hargrove's office door cracked open. "Nurse Walsh, step away from that patient immediately." His voice carried the particular timbre of a man who'd just realized he had no authority over what was about to happen and was frantically trying to reassert it through words. She ignored him, prepping the needle with the antiseptic swab, finding the anatomical landmark between the second and third ribs, the midclavicular line where the needle would go. "That is an order. You are not authorized to perform invasive procedures on any patient. Step away." Hargrove's voice had risen now, had taken on the desperate edge of someone realizing the narrative was slipping from his control. Margaret inserted the needle at the precise angle, felt the slight resistance of the chest wall yield, and then the hiss, the unmistakable sound of pressurized air escaping from a collapsed lung, a sound like relief itself made audible. Pierce's breathing eased immediately. Color returned to his lips. His hands unclenched from their rigid fists. "You've just performed an invasive procedure entirely outside your scope of practice," Hargrove said, and now his voice carried something like satisfaction underneath the anger, the sound of a man who'd found exactly what he needed to end this. "Security, remove Nurse Walsh from this building. She is suspended effective immediately pending termination." Ramon Torres approached reluctantly, the security guard who'd worked at Mercy General for 11 years and still believed in things like fairness. His jaw was tight. "I'm sorry. I have to escort you out of the building." Margaret looked at Pierce, now stable, his oxygen saturation probably climbing, his breathing no longer the ragged desperate gasping of minutes before. She looked at Hargrove standing in his doorway with his phone already in his hand, his fingers already moving across the screen, already calling someone, already building his documentation. "He would have died," Margaret said simply. "Without that decompression, his heart would have stopped in the next 90 seconds. Hargrove didn't respond. He was already talking to someone on the phone. "Crawford, it's Hargrove. We have our documentation now. Nurse Walsh performed unauthorized invasive procedures on a patient in the emergency department. Multiple witnesses. I'm suspending her pending immediate termination." Margaret could hear Crawford's voice on the other end, small and tinny, saying something about board approval and legal review, but Hargrove was already done listening to what Crawford thought. "He would have died," Margaret said again to no one in particular, and Ramon took her gently by the elbow and walked her out through the automatic doors into a San Diego night that had turned cool and strange, as if the world recognized that something had shifted, some axis had tilted, some invisible equilibrium had broken. The parking lot spread out behind her, sodium lights bleeding orange across the asphalt. Margaret sat in her car for 20 minutes, hands shaking now that the adrenaline was fading, staring at the employee badge they'd taken at the door. The badge was laminated plastic, nothing more, 3 years compressed into a piece of identification, now worthless. Through the windshield, she could see the ER entrance, fluorescent light spilling across the concrete where the intruder had collapsed, where she'd knelt and done what needed doing. Inside Mercy General, Dr. Marcus Hargrove was already writing. His fingers moved across the keyboard with the precision of someone constructing a narrative, building a case that had been scaffolding itself for weeks. The incident report took him 17 minutes. He copied board members Chen and Crawford on the email, his subject line clinical and damning, immediate termination, patient safety violation. The body of the report was a masterpiece of selective truth. Nurse performed an authorized invasive medical procedure in direct violation of hospital policy and physician orders, demonstrating dangerous lack of judgment and disregard for established chain of command. Previous documented performance issues support immediate termination. Patient safety requires swift action. He attached her performance review, the one he'd written himself, every line a knife wound. He attached the public write-up. He attached statements he'd solicited from 3 physicians about her concerning rigidity in protocols, physicians who'd never worked directly with her but who understood that aligning with Hargrove was career advancement and opposing him was career suicide. Then he made his phone calls. First to Patricia Reeves, the external HR consultant he'd already contracted, the one he'd specifically requested months ago when he'd decided Margaret Walsh represented exactly the kind of obstacle that needed removal. I need you here tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. sharp. I have a termination that needs documentation. There's an incident from tonight, a nurse performing a procedure completely outside her scope. I've been building this file for months. She's dangerous. The hospital needs protection. Patricia Reeves, who'd never met Margaret, who didn't know that needle decompression in the hands of someone trained in combat medicine is not a reckless act but a calculated one, agreed that she could be there by 8:33 a.m. Then to board member Crawford, who'd invested heavily in the efficiency metrics Hargrove promised. We have a situation that requires immediate board awareness. One of the older nurses, Margaret Walsh, performed an emergency surgical procedure tonight without authorization. It's insubordination at best, reckless endangerment at worst. I've documented a pattern. I wanted you to hear it from me before the administrator calls an emergency session. Crawford, who'd been dreaming of the cost savings Hargrove's fast discharge protocols would provide, who'd already bragged to the hospital foundation about the modernization happening under his watch, asked only one question: can we terminate her immediately? Hargrove said yes. Then to board member Chen, with a slightly different angle. I'm concerned we have a liability issue. An older nurse, some resistance to new protocols, possible cognitive decline manifesting as judgment errors. I wanted legal to be aware that we've been documenting concerns. Tonight's incident will likely require immediate action. I'm not the type to cry wolf, but this is serious. Chen, who'd always found Margaret's quiet intensity unsettling, who'd served on a hospital board for 14 years and learned that the squeaky wheel, the one that filed safety reports, often needed to be removed, nodded along to every word. Hargrove's strategy was flawless because it was not desperate. It was methodical. He'd identified his target, he'd assembled his allies, he'd documented his case, and now he was executing it like a surgeon, clean, efficient, terminal. By the time Margaret drove home to her small house on the edge of San Diego, still wearing her scrubs, still carrying the smell of the intruder on her clothes, diesel fuel and blood and something older, something that smelled like Kandahar, it was already finished. She sat at her kitchen table in the dark. The house was small enough that the table, the stove, and the sink felt like they were all in the same room. She'd bought the place 7 years ago, after the nightmares had become manageable enough that she could commit to a mortgage, to something rooted. The walls were bare except for one photograph, her and David at his Naval Academy graduation, both of them in dress uniforms, though no one at the hospital knew she'd ever worn one. That's where David found her at 9 p.m., his key turning in the lock. He'd stopped by to drop off groceries like he did every Tuesday, his mother's pride and his attempt to bridge the gap between her closed-off world and whatever life he was building at Camp Pendleton. He set a paper bag on the counter, organic chicken and sweet potatoes and the expensive coffee she preferred, and then he saw her sitting in the dark at the table, shoulders curved inward like someone had taken all her weight and concentrated it at the base of her spine. "Mom? Why are you home? Your shift doesn't end until 7 a.m. She couldn't find words. The architecture of composure she'd built over 22 years of military service, reinforced through 3 tours of Kandahar, maintained through years of silence and anonymity, it had a weight limit, and she'd reached it. The tears came then, her shoulders shaking with a kind of trembling that wasn't fear. It was something closer to rage, or grief, or the sound of something breaking that had been held together with willpower alone. David sat beside her, his hand on her shoulder. He was her son, and she loved him with the ferocity of someone who'd learned to love in a war zone, where every connection was provisional, where people disappeared. "Mom, what happened?" "I saved someone's life tonight," she whispered. "And they fired me for it." He didn't understand. How could he? David had never served, had chosen to pursue naval intelligence instead of combat operations, had built a career in language and analysis rather than action. He knew his mother worked as a cardiac ICU nurse. He knew she was quiet, competent, reliable. He didn't know about Kandahar. He didn't know about the 22 years before the scrubs, before the anonymity, before she'd chosen to become invisible. He didn't know about the needle, the training, the muscle memory that had taken over when she recognized the signs of tension pneumothorax, the absent breath sounds on the left, the way the intruder's oxygen saturation had begun its fatal decline. She'd walked away from that life when the PTSD became too much, when the nightmares made her wake up screaming, when she'd had to choose between the military and sanity. She'd chosen sanity, or something close to it. She'd chosen this small house and this quiet job and the careful invisibility of being just a nurse, one of thousands, unremarkable and unknown. She'd sewn her old unit patch into the lining of her jacket, a faded piece of cloth with a symbol that meant everything and nothing, kept it close like a talisman, like a prayer, like an apology to the person she'd been. Now that choice felt like cowardice. She couldn't explain the politics to David, the way Hargrove had been building this case since the day he arrived, how he'd seen her file safety reports and marked her as a threat to his efficiency metrics. She couldn't explain that saving a life in a hospital where the chief of medicine had decided you were expendable was the same as signing your termination notice. She couldn't explain that the intruder, the 6'5" man with the crowbar and the wild eyes, had been speaking Pashto, the language of Kandahar, the voice of every combat casualty she'd treated in field hospitals where there was no time for authorization, no protocol, just the naked choice between action and death. David held her while she cried, his hand steady on her shoulder, and neither of them spoke about what would happen next. Outside, the San Diego night had turned cool and strange, as if the world recognized that something had shifted, some axis had tilted. The fluorescent lights at Mercy General hummed their electric song. In an upstairs office, an HR investigator packed her briefcase for the termination hearing scheduled for Thursday morning. In another office, Dr. Hargrove reviewed his documentation one more time, the case so airtight that he almost felt sorry for her. Almost. 72 hours later, Margaret sat in the hospital administrator's conference room with her hands folded on the table, waiting for formality to complete what Hargrove had already decided. Outside, David paced the hallway in his Class A dress uniform, his commanding officer's insignia catching the fluorescent lights. Inside, Administrator Park shuffled through her folder with the expression of someone delivering news she'd already rehearsed. The termination hearing was a checkbox, nothing more. Margaret knew this. She'd seen enough institutional machinery to recognize when a decision had already been written. Park looked up from her papers. "Ms. Walsh, regarding your suspension and the incident in the emergency department, we have documentation that shows the door opened. For Navy personnel in dress uniforms entered, their presence filling the room like a pressure change. The lead officer, a weathered commander with 3 stars on his collar, addressed the administrator directly. We're looking for Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh. By rank and name." The room went still. Park's pen stopped mid-sentence. The junior board member, Crawford, actually sat backward in his chair to stare. "Senior Chief." The words hung in the air like a surgical light, illuminating everything that had been deliberately obscured. Margaret's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She stood. "I'm her." The SEAL commander nodded once, a gesture that carried the weight of protocol and recognition. "We need to speak with you." Classified briefing. Outside the conference room, David's pacing stopped. Through the small window in the door, he saw his mother rise. He saw the uniforms. His face went pale, and when she emerged moments later to bring him inside, he whispered it like a question, "Senior Chief?" "Mom." She didn't answer. The answer was walking into that room with her. The board member Crawford, his hands trembling slightly, read from a military file handed to him by the commander. His voice was thin, unpracticed with terminology but precise with horror. 22 years, Naval Special Warfare. Combat Medical Specialist. 3 tours, Kandahar. Bronze Star. He paused, swallowed. Navy Cross. Another pause. Longer. 2 Navy Crosses. The second medal seemed to register with Crawford physically, his shoulders sank. Silver Star. For Purple Hearts. He looked up from the file, his eyes searching Margaret's face as if seeing her for the first time. She stood with the same composure she'd maintained through 3 years of erasure, through Hargrove's humiliation, through watching younger nurses leave the break room. The commander's voice came next, clipped and efficient. The patient from Tuesday night was Lieutenant Commander James Pierce. Naval Intelligence. Missing for 6 days before extraction. Margaret's breath didn't change. David's hand found her shoulder. "The emergency procedure you performed, the needle decompression, that wasn't just medical intervention. That procedure extracted classified information Pierce had hidden in a subcutaneous data port beneath his ribs. Information he couldn't risk surrendering while in enemy hands." The commander continued without inflection, as if reading a manifest. "That intelligence prevented a coordinated attack on a convoy operating in Kandahar. Your convoy included Captain David Walsh's unit. 43 Marines who came home because you walked toward someone everyone else ran from." David's grip tightened on her shoulder. Margaret's eyes didn't move from the window behind the board. Rain was starting outside, hammering the glass like applause. "The Navy Cross for that action has been submitted. It will be processed and awarded independently of this hospital's employment decisions." The administrator Park had stopped breathing. The HR investigator, Patricia Reeves, the external consultant Hargrove had specifically requested, was now reading Hargrove's documentation with the expression of someone who'd just realized she'd been handed a bomb disguised as a briefcase. Park's voice emerged carefully. "I see. I see." She turned to the file on her desk. "This hospital has placed Dr. Marcus Hargrove on immediate administrative leave pending investigation into." The commander raised his hand. Barely a gesture. Park stopped mid-sentence. "That's not why we're here. We're here for Senior Chief Walsh. She'll be reinstated to full active duty status effective immediately. Her civilian employment status is resolved." Another officer handed a folder to Administrator Park. "Her medical license, certifications, and credentials have all been verified and cleared at the federal level. We've also reviewed Dr. Hargrove's conduct. The board will receive a separate briefing on his actions regarding false documentation and conflict of interest violations." That's when the security guard came in. Ramon Torres, the same guard who'd carried Margaret's box of personal items out to her car 3 days ago, who'd witnessed her walking out with her hands shaking and her voice steady. He was holding another box. He set it down in front of Dr. Hargrove's empty chair and looked at Park. "Where is he?" Park gestured toward Hargrove's office. Ramon nodded and walked out. 2 minutes later, he returned with Hargrove, whose confidence had been replaced by the look of a man watching a building collapse with him still inside it. His eyes went to the uniforms first, then to Margaret. Understanding moved across his face like a wave. Ramon placed the box, Hargrove's box, his desk items, his severance folder, in front of him. When Hargrove looked at Ramon, Ramon met his eyes with quiet satisfaction and said the words that would define the rest of Hargrove's life, "I believe you know the way out, sir." The medical board revoked his license 2 weeks later. The audit of his discharge protocols revealed 17 premature releases that resulted in readmissions, 2 of which resulted in patient deaths. His efficiency metrics, the ones he'd promised to the board, the ones that threatened Margaret's career, were purchased with human cost. His contract was terminated with cause. No severance. No reference letters. His networking, the careful calls to Crawford and Chen, the strategic deployment of Patricia Reeves as his investigator, all of it became evidence of conspiracy rather than due diligence. 6 months later, Margaret visited David at Camp Pendleton. Her clearance still active enough to move through the base without question, she and her son had lunch at the commissary, and for the first time, he asked, "Why didn't you tell me?" She touched the scar on her forearm absently. "Because I needed to become someone else for a while. The PTSD was unbearable. I couldn't trust myself. I chose anonymity. I chose to heal quietly." David nodded slowly, understanding in a way he couldn't have before. "And now?" Margaret looked at her hands, steady hands, scarred hands, hands that had held lives together in places most people couldn't imagine. "Now I know I can't hide who I am, even when it's easier." On the drive back to San Diego, passing through strip malls and traffic that looked like peacetime, Margaret glimpsed a familiar figure through a chain-link fence. Dr. Hargrove sat at a folding table beneath a faded umbrella, selling supplemental insurance policies from a stack of brochures. His suit was wrinkled. His posture was defeated. The parking lot was mostly empty. Margaret slowed but didn't stop. Some moments don't require witness. The punishment was already written. Back at Mercy General the following week, reinstated to day shift in the cardiac ICU with a formal apology from the board and a commendation in her personnel file, Margaret opened her locker. Inside hung the jacket she'd kept through 3 years of invisibility, the one she'd brought on her first day as a nurse, back when she was trying to forget who she'd been. She ran her fingers over the faded Special Warfare Unit patch sewn inside the lining, feeling the worn embroidery under her fingertips. The stitching was still solid. 22 years, and the unit patch held. Colonel James Morrison, fully recovered now and cleared for limited duty, stopped by the unit to thank her personally for her care. He asked about David. He said, quietly, that he understood now why David had always been the steadiest officer in the room. Margaret pulled on her jacket against the evening chill and walked out to her car, where David waited to take her to dinner. The younger nurses, Sarah, Tom, Jennifer, watched from the station, understanding now what they'd dismissed. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. Thank you for watching. If Margaret's story resonates with you, please subscribe to see more stories of hidden heroes and quiet courage. Like this video and comment below. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who they were standing next to? Let's talk about the people who change everything and nobody even knows.